We can utilize monuments to teach us of the past.
But we don't need monuments whose intention is to reinforce what is odious.
The American Religious Town Hall meeting is now in session.
Welcome, friends, to the American Religious Town Hall meeting, where the discussion of religious, political, and social issues is meant to promote the cause of religious freedom and to help us better understand each other. And now, here's your host and moderator, Pastor Jerry Lutz.
Thank you, Mark. And again, I'm so glad you've joined us today for this discussion here at the American Religious Town Hall meeting. If you're a longtime viewer, welcome back. If you have friends that have never tuned in, what's the holdup? Give them a call. Have them join us. We'd love to have them a part of the program by listening and sending us notes. Anyway, we're glad you're here today for this discussion particularly. We'll get into it in just a few moments, but before we do that, I'd like for you to meet the panelists. We'll have them introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what they do. Let's begin with the gentleman to my right.
Hi, I'm John Robert Skeldon. I'm a priest of the Catholic Diocese of Fort Worth. I serve at St. Patrick's Cathedral in downtown Fort Worth, Texas.
I'm Rabbi Jordan Ofsire, a longtime panelist of American Religious Town Hall.
I'm Tom Plumley. I'm the senior minister at First Christian Church in Fort Worth, Texas. Our congregation is a part of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ.
Bert Beach. I'm an ordained minister of the Seventh Avenue Church. I live just a few miles from our world headquarters in the Washington, D.C. area, Silver Spring, Maryland, where I served for several decades.
I'm Tony Matthews, and I'm the senior pastor of North Garland Baptist Fellowship in Garland, Texas, here in the Dallas Metroplex.
And I'm Mel Robeck. I'm an ordained minister with the Assemblies of God, but I serve the church at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California, where I am senior professor of church history and ecumenics and special assistant to the president for ecumenical relations.
Well, thank you, everyone, for being here today for today's discussion. Dr. Matthews, welcome back again. For those of you who might have missed the last couple of programs, Dr. Matthews is kind of new to the program. He's been here for a couple of weeks now. Glad to have you back.
Good to be
here. You ready
here.
to get into the subject today? Well, let's do then. The late English church historian Henry Chadwick once observed that, quote, "Nothing is sadder than someone who has lost his memory, and the church which has lost its memory is in the same state of senility." Close quote. One could also argue that this also applies to nations. American leaders frequently appeal to the words and actions of earlier generations, their leaders, even their wars. One way of keeping historical memory alive is by the building of monuments. They are typically intended to remind us of our past. In recent months, though, we have seen many historical monuments in the U.S. and in other places around the world either moved or destroyed, placed in a museum somewhere. Many people consider them reminders of horrible, oppressive realities. For example, slavery. Others look at these same memorials as tributes to their success. Regardless of the position taken, we would like the panel to discuss these questions today. First of all, should certain monuments be preserved even if they are offensive to some, or should certain monuments be removed or destroyed because they are offensive to some? Second question, does the removal of monuments endanger our understanding of history? And then finally, what other ways can Americans use to preserve us from a form of national dementia? That is our discussion for today. We're so glad again that you've tuned in. We're going to go back to those who helped begin our program today. And for that, let's go back to Rabbi Ofsire. Welcome to the program today, and tell us a little more on your thoughts on this subject.
Well, to continue the way the subject has been introduced, many monuments retain for us only recollections from history and not current meaning for us. It seems to me that the ones that should be preserved are the ones that can teach us of our past in ways that are consistent with what the majority of Americans believed. That's a very difficult question. For those that no longer teach us of the past, we can also place them in museums so they can remind us of things that we might have believed and might like to know about but don't necessarily believe today. So monuments serve very, very broadly based significances, and we need to be clear about whether they are still relevant in place, should be destroyed, or should be placed in a museum for respect.
All right, thank you, Rabbi. Let's go across the way to Reverend Plumley. Welcome back to the program. Your thoughts on this subject, please, some more of them.
Thank you. I want to begin by simply saying there's a difference between reminding and glorifying. And I think we need to take great care when we place monuments and when we look at monuments, anything that we say about monuments, because there's a difference between remembering and glorifying. In America currently, the most recent argument about monuments has, of course, been centered around monuments to the Confederacy or to leaders of the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee statues, Stonewall Jackson placed around various places, folk like that. I also think it's important. Let me talk about those specific monuments. On those issues, I think it's vital that we remember the Civil War. It's vital that we remember people who are part of this nation trying to decide what it was, what it is. But you know, one of the things that we also need to do when we look at a monument is to know the history of the monument itself. Many of those Civil War memorials, many of those monuments to the Confederacy and to Confederate leaders were put up at times, were created at times when racial strife in the United States was a particular concern. And they were put up specifically in order to remind people of color that we, in this community, were a part of the folks that were fighting against the Union, and we will maintain our supremacy over you. And that was the intention of the placing of those monuments. A lot of those monuments were put up in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. A lot of those monuments were put up in the 1990s and 1920s when there was another general scare that African Americans were getting too much, were gaining too much in American society.
All right, thank you for starting out the program, gentlemen. Let's go to the others now. Dr. Beach, welcome to the program. Your thoughts on this subject now?
I'm personally worried a little bit about the lack of understanding regarding the past in the U.S. at the present time. You have historical departments in schools being reduced. They're teaching less history than they used to, and I think it's a very bad trend. Now, it's true that some people stand out from the past that may seem to be, to us, by our standards of today, wrong. But that was not the standard in their day. And therefore, they can be a great person anyhow, and standing for people in their day, even though they made mistakes. I mean, you look at the historians, you look back in history, any country you go back 100 years or 200 years, the leaders, even though they're great people in a way, honored by their nation, looking by today's standards, they were very bad people. You look at the doctors that treated people in the past, they were killing them very often. So therefore, they should be treated today as murderers. That type of an attitude. We can't transfer to the past the same standards we have today. That doesn't mean we have to accept every little statute that's been established by somebody that will, to honor somebody that was probably not that very serious in honor. But I happen to think that some of the leaders of the Confederacy were great people in a way. Robert E. Lee, I consider him to be a great man, even though he was wrong in that point. They wanted to appoint him as chairman, or not chairman, the head of the U.S. Army. And he said, I can't go with the U.S. because my state of Virginia has gone back. In those days, they had the concept the state was more important than the national government. Today, we don't have that concept. The state is insignificant. I live in Maryland. I don't care too much about the state of Maryland. I care about the U.S. But a lot of people don't have that, maybe that same concept.
No offense to our fellow Marylanders, we all love you.
I just think
I'm
you
from
have
there
to
as well,
remember
so
the past.
yes.
They were great people in the past.
Thank you.
Not by today's standards, but they
All
were
right.
great people.
Thank you. Dr. Matthews, glad to have you here again. Your
Good
thoughts?
to be here. Good to be here, and I'm very grateful that the American Religious Town Hall meeting is addressing this topic. I think it is a topic that has to be addressed civilly, and I think that it's really important for us to understand that when we talk about the removal of the monuments, the statues, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, that for the African American community, those statues are linked to obviously the Civil War, which was fought to perpetuate slavery and states' rights to promote slavery. So in my mind, the monuments cannot be separated from that historical fact. And as Tom mentioned, I'm glad he brought that out, is that many of the monuments were erected in the early 1900s, 1950s and 60s. And in the 1900s, of course, Jim Crow was taking place, and we saw a spike in the 1950s and 60s with the monuments being built as a backlash of progress for African Americans. Now, I may get myself in trouble with my community by saying this, but this is where I am. I believe that the monuments can remain so long as we erect monuments juxtaposed to them of abolitionists, civil rights leaders, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, George Washington Carver, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, Shirley Chisholm. And then that way we can maintain the educational system. And one last thing quickly, I came across this. Roger Taney, because Robert E. Lee and Stonewall, they get a lot of press with this, but Roger Taney, the 5th Chief Justice of the U.S., he was the chief author in the 1857 Dred Scott decision. And I think it would be great if now they tore the statue down there in Annapolis, Maryland, from what I understand, and I think that was a right decision to make. And if they had left it, it would be great to put another statue up just to pose it so history can be told, the story.
Thank you, Rabbi. You have a...
Yeah, I'd like to suggest that we stop for a moment and ask ourselves, what was the purpose for establishing monuments in the first place? It was intended to aggrandize particular people. It was intended to make them, to cause us to feel some kind of appreciation or respect for them or for the things that they had done. That really is the underlying etiology of statues, of monuments, and that should help us to clarify our own minds with respect to those that should be retained in place, destroyed, or put in a museum. Why were those statues and monuments put up in the first place? That would lead us clearly to the second place and choices.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Robeck, your thoughts, please.
Yeah. The first thing that came to my mind as I began to think about this was that Joshua led the people across the Jordan and into the Promised Land. And the first thing he says, as soon as they get across, is, I want you to pick up 12 stones, and I want you to build this monument here. And when your children come to you and ask, what is this about? You explain to them that God took us across this river on dry ground and brought us into the land of plenty. I think that's a really important illustration. It was a culturally inclusive, understood to be something resident in what God had done on behalf of the people of God. One could argue, I think, that the bread and the wine, the loaf and the chalice set side by side, are a memorial that we as Christians look at and we say, this is something that God has done on behalf of us through Christ Jesus. What I think memorials should do is they should be culturally inclusive. And I think about the Statue of Liberty, for instance. Statue of Liberty was intended to, in a sense, glorify, but certainly lift up and remind us of the ideal of freedom and liberty that this country provided for any immigrant that came in through the harbor of New York. And I think that's really important, that it be viewed as a culturally inclusive or a nationally inclusive kind of a thing. But I also remember the first time I visited Lookout Mountain in Tennessee, back in the early 70s. I went up there and I was not at all, let me say it this way, I was taken aback by all of the monuments to the military coming from Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, Indiana. I didn't see any Confederate monuments. All I saw was Northern monuments. And I thought, you know, all I've ever heard is the war is not dead in the South. Why? Because it's always in their face. And I think these monuments, you know, really do not serve good purposes. Monuments in many cases are time limited. Just think about Iraq and pulling down that monument of Saddam Hussein. Think about Russia and Lenin and Stalin being pulled down. Queen Victoria is everywhere, and you know the countries that were subject to colonialism, I think, are asking for new pictures. I think it's extremely important that America recognize and remember its ugly parts. The way we treated Native Americans, the way we treated African Americans, the way we've treated Hispanics throughout the Southwest, all of those kinds of things. But we need to find a way to remind ourselves of that, and memorials are a way to do that.
All right, thank you. Father Skeldon, we haven't heard from you yet. Your thoughts, please.
Well, again, just to thank you for being here. You know, Faulkner has that great quote in Requiem for a Nun, the past is never dead, it's not even past. And I think that there's sort of a, you know, in some sense, like when Dr. Matthews brought up Roger Taney, I was like sort of grimacing because, of course, sadly, you know, he was the first Roman Catholic Chief Justice, you know, and of course in an age, right, in the 19th century in which so many Catholics were looked down upon as well, you know, in the great waves of immigration, yet he would sort of author, you know, such an opinion is sad. I think in some sense, you know, history, you know, and memory, and I think that this is the great distinction that Reverend Plumley made between remembering and glorifying, right? And so sometimes we need to remember and we need to mourn or lament. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we remember and we need to, you know, give the glory and honor to God, you know. You know, I think about, I would never want to see like Auschwitz torn down. That's got to always be in our face, and we have to lament and lament and lament, right? So I mean, I think it's
instructions,
right. And so it's always very contextual, you know. And I think that's the primary purpose.
All right, thank you very much. Further thoughts? We just have a few moments left. Reverend Plumley.
Yeah, I just think it's really critical what education goes, what process of educating goes along with the monument.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Monuments to the Holocaust are super valuable. But if somebody else is telling the story, if some skinhead group is telling the story, they may not they may pass along values that I don't want passed along to my grandkids.
The monuments can't stand alone.
There you go.
Dr. Matthews, any further thoughts? You made an intriguing suggestion regarding putting monuments that would be at least parallel with, or to tell the whole story, if you will.
Yes, I believe that if monuments are going to remain, as I mentioned earlier, that we should have other monuments that will show the triumph that the civil rights leaders and the abolitionists made. And another factor is today, the day and time we live in today, with many of the racial murders that have taken place, these things kind of heat up the racial tension in America, and they have consequences. And so this is, I believe, one reason why there's a great move to remove the monuments. And finally, I'm a firm believer, if the monuments are going to stay without other monuments, remove them and put them in a museum.
All right, thank you. That's all the time we have for this segment. We'll be back in just a few moments. There's an important announcement I'd like for you to hear.
Thank you, Pastor Lutz. We hope you are enjoying today's program. If you would like to learn more about the American Religious Town Hall, please visit our website at americanreligious.org. That's americanreligious.org. There you can read about the mission and history of the program, learn about the Town Hall estates, and view past programs by clicking the appropriate menu buttons. Each week, Pastor Lutz looks forward to receiving your letters. You may write to him at the address shown on your screen. Send your letters to Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. That's Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. Thank you for writing, and thank you for watching. And now, back to you, Pastor Lutz, and today's closing statements.
Thank you. Mark has reminded me that many of our very interesting programs have been as a result of your sending in topic suggestions that we've debated around this table. So thank you for the cards and letters. And please do go to the website, look at the American Religious Town Hall estates. You'll find some interesting things there. Plus, we have past programs archived for your enjoyment. Now let's go to the summations, and for that, let's begin with Father Skeldon. You're first.
Well, again, just to thank you for letting me be here. I would just want to reiterate, what we think fundamentally about history. And we learn history and we study history so that, in some sense, it's not repeated. Now, often, of course, it does get repeated with various iterations, even in our own time. But the point, though, is that hopefully we learn even in sort of the haphazard way that we go forward. And I think with the whole debate about the monuments, especially in 2017 in modern United States history, is to really understand the context. Just because a certain individual has had a monument put to them or made for them, we have to really ask the very hard question of, it's not that we want to glorify who that person is and what they stood for. And in fact, sometimes we have to even take a strong stance to subject what they stood for at that time in light of further development.
All right, thank you very much, Reverend Plumley.
Thank you. I think one of the things that hadn't been said here that needs to be said is that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Mm-hmm. And when we're putting up monuments, we need to remember that. And if nobody's ever going to put up a monument to Plumley, but that's the first thing that should be said if it were. I think of a little statue down the street from my church of the guy who was in charge of Fort Worth when it was created to fight the Indians. Probably needs a statue of an Indian next to it, a Comanche.
And with that, we go to Dr. Matthews.
Okay, thanks again for a great topic. In summation, I would remind us all that the gospel changes hearts, and we can take this awful situation that's happening, have a silver lining, and spread the gospel so that hearts can change.
Thank you very much, Dr. Robeck.
Next to the Bible, I would say history is one of the most difficult topics ever to teach. People don't want to hear about it. It reminds them of a past. In other ways, it would just as soon be forgotten. I would say that monuments can serve a very valuable teaching tool in history, but when it becomes symbolic of pride for past oppression, or when it becomes hurtful to a people because of past oppression, then I think it needs to go. And I also think that anybody who uses it as a source of pride to divide our country needs to be held accountable to their words and actions.
All right, thank you, Dr. Beach. Just a few
I think
moments remaining.
history is very important. I may be a little bit led by the fact that I'm a historian, but I think it's very important in my past. I look back at the leaders in the church, leaders in the history, leaders in our country, leaders even in Switzerland. I know those leaders by heart because I was taught in the Swiss schools every detail they did, every battle they won. And they were not perfect, but they were great people.
All right, thank you very much. And Rabbi Oxide.
Thank you. I'd like to remind us, each and every one of us, that every monument, whether we like it or not, has an historical context. And it seems to me that there should be equal responsibility upon those who construct the monuments to make sure that it is particularly clear, that it is entirely clear what the intent of that particular monument was. How that should be done would leave to the docents and to the people involved in the situation. But I think that that's crucial. Why would one establish a monument unless there was a particular situation, particular person that people respected very, very much? And so it seems to be essential that we do that.
Well, thank you, all of you, very much. This has been a very timely and informative discussion today, and we hope you enjoyed this and that you'll come back again next time. But for now, the Charter of the American Religious Town Hall provides that Roman Catholics, Protestants, Jews, educators, and others may appear on this program and can declare their beliefs without hesitancy. And the rest of the members of the panel will uphold and guarantee that American right to all who will appear, irrespective of race or creed, so that the rest of the world can see that here in America we believe in civil and religious freedom, not only in theory but in reality. So now, friends, until next week at the same time and however you tuned in, the American Religious Town Hall meeting stands adjourned. May the God of all of us bless all of you.